the Windover Archaeology, the next generation, and we'll be talking about the past, present, and future of this amazing discovery.
I wanted to write a book so that everybody could learn about this site because it was so fascinating. And of course, Ben, helped me tremendously because FHS Press published the book. So
they pulled DNA from the brains of mummies buried in a Florida swamp for 8,000 years. And what came back from that lab shook the scientists who spent their careers studying this site.
And he stood up and he says, "You better believe it. This is like nothing we've ever seen."
Not because the DNA survived. That alone was already impossible. But because of what it revealed about who these people actually were, how long they had been here, and what they had already built long before anyone thought civilization on this continent had even started. The researchers didn't use the word terrified lightly.
To see what it was that I did pick up out of there. And as I turned it around, it was looking at me.
Once you see the results, you'll understand why. The machine stopped the human skull. His first assumption was the same one anyone would make. Someone had been murdered and dumped in the water. Police were called. A coroner examined the skull and noted something that immediately complicated that theory. The bone was dark throughout, stained by prolonged immersion in peat. This was not a recent death. This was not a police matter.
The pond functionally acts as a gateway, if you will, to the next world. And that may well have been the way people looked at and thought about the pond.
The coroner made the call that would change everything. An archaeologist was needed. Glenn Doran was a young assistant professor at Florida State University, specializing in human skeletal remains. He drove out to Brevard County expecting very little. What he found did nothing to raise those expectations. A small, dark, uninviting pond surrounded by unremarkable Florida scrubland. He walked the perimeter anyway. Within minutes, he was looking at clusters of human skeletal material eroding out of the peat banks. Then he found 4 more skulls, and the teeth told him something immediately. The wear patterns were extreme, the kind that accumulates only when teeth are used as tools, not simply for eating. Modern people do not produce wear like that. Ancient people did. He knew before a single laboratory result came back.
It was clearly somebody who had lived, thousands of years ago.
That he was looking at remains from deep prehistory. Radiocarbon dating confirmed it. The bones were between 7,000 and 8,000 years old, 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, 3,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid, 2,000 years before Stonehenge. The team described the results as walking on clouds. They had expected old. They had not expected this. But the age was only the beginning of what this pond was hiding, draining the impossible. The remains were underwater, and anything excavated without controlled conditions would be destroyed within hours of exposure to open air. It took 2 full years to engineer a solution. 150 well points were sunk into the peat, and pumps ran around the clock, pulling 700 gallons of water per minute out of the marsh. Slowly, the floor of the bog came into view. What the team saw was not what anyone had prepared for. Body after body emerged from the peat. Men, women, children. Most were in the fetal position, exactly as they had been placed by the people who buried them. The arrangement was deliberate and consistent across the entire floor of the marsh. When the full count was completed, 168 individuals had been recovered. Dating tests on the burial ground revealed it had been in continuous use for 1,300 years. This was not a catastrophe, not a mass death. This was a cemetery. A prehistoric community had been returning their dead to this specific location, generation after generation, for longer than the entire span of recorded European history. The first question any scientist asks when confronted with remains this old is simple. Why are they still here? Bone is organic material. Given sufficient time, moisture, and bacteria, it dissolves completely. In most environments, an 8,000-year-old skeleton leaves absolutely nothing behind. The Florida heat alone should have accelerated that process far beyond any reasonable hope of recovery. And yet, the Windover remains looked, in the assessment of forensic specialists who examined them, like people who had died within the last few years. What they found next inside those skulls is about to rewrite every assumption about who was here first, and you need to see where this goes. Subscribe so you don't lose the thread. The explanation for the preservation was elegant and entirely accidental. The pond was a peat bog, decomposed vegetation compressed over centuries into a dense, oxygen-poor medium hostile to the bacteria responsible for biological decay. The bodies had been submerged quickly after death, sealed into an anaerobic environment before decomposition could take hold. And Windover had a second factor that made it exceptional even among bog sites worldwide. The peat chemistry was non-acidic. Most bogs dissolve bone over long periods. At Windover, the chemistry preserved both bone and soft tissue. If these people had been buried in ordinary dry earth, their bones would have been gone within a couple of years. The bog held them for 80 centuries. And it had held something else too. Something no one had thought to look for yet. Something inside the skulls. Weeks into the dig, a series of skulls proved far heavier than they should have been.
Mashing footprints and things like that into the floor of the excavation.
Bone alone does not produce that kind of weight. Something was inside. When researchers looked into the cranial cavity, they could see a pale, compacted mass sitting where the brain had once been. The working assumption was peat intrusion. Organic material from the surrounding sediment filtered in over millennia and solidified inside the skull. Reasonable, logical, wrong. One skull, belonging to a woman estimated to have been around 45 years old at death, was transported to the University of Florida for imaging. An MRI scan removed any remaining ambiguity. The mass inside the cranial cavity was not peat. It had structure, defined biological structure. When researchers carefully removed it, the laboratory went silent. They were looking at a human brain, reduced to roughly a quarter of its normal size through desiccation and the pressures of millennia in waterlogged sediment, but unmistakable. The folds were present. The overall form was intact. A human brain, 8,000 years old, recovered in a condition that allowed its cellular architecture to be examined under a microscope. 91 prehistoric brains were eventually recovered from the Windover site. Not traces, not impressions, not chemical residue. The actual organs inside which 8,000-year-old thoughts had formed. Let that land for a second. Homo sapiens has not changed neurologically in 150,000 years. The brain sitting in a laboratory in Florida was not a primitive organ. It was structurally identical to the brain of the scientist examining it. The Windover people were fully modern humans in every biological sense. Whatever they experienced, whatever they understood, whatever they felt, they processed it with exactly the same cognitive architecture we use today. The bog had not just preserved their bodies, it had preserved the evidence of their minds. And inside those minds, if the cells had held, there might be something, even more impossible, something that geneticist Bill Houseworth was about to spend months trying to pull out of the dark. The DNA that should not exist. Cellular structure visible under a microscope told Bill Houseworth one thing. If the architecture of the cells had held together across 8,000 years of waterlogged burial, there was a possibility, remote, unprecedented, the kind of possibility you don't say out loud, that the cells still contained DNA, damaged, fragmented, chemically degraded, almost certainly, but potentially present, potentially extractable. The extraction process involved mixing samples of ancient brain tissue with enzymes designed to break down cellular material and release any genetic content still locked inside. 8,000 years in a waterlogged environment should have destroyed it completely. Heat, moisture, microbial activity.
Representations of stratigraphy, which is how archaeologists tell time, what was happening at different times based on these different layers of dirt or peat, whatever you're working in.
All of it works against DNA preservation. Florida was not Siberian permafrost. Nobody in that laboratory seriously expected this to work. The results came back positive. Houseworth sat with the data for a long time before he said anything to anyone. Human DNA, not contamination from surrounding vegetation, not environmental material carried in by the peat. Human genetic sequences recovered from brain tissue sitting at the bottom of a Florida bog since 3,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids were built. He checked everything twice. The implications were already forming. This was going to change the story. He moved immediately to the contamination problem, because that is where the entire result could unravel. Ancient DNA recovery has one persistent failure mode: modern human DNA from researchers handling the specimens can infiltrate samples and produce false positives. He mapped the Windover sequences against the known genetic profiles of different ethnic populations. The result was unambiguous. The DNA was distinctly Native American in type, a genetic signature that distinguishes it cleanly from European, African, and Asian profiles. Since no Native Americans had been involved in the handling of the specimens, modern contamination could be ruled out with confidence. What Houseworth had recovered was genuine Stone Age DNA, the oldest confirmed human genetic material extracted anywhere on Earth at the time of the discovery, and it was about to tell him exactly who these people were. What the sequences revealed. The sequences told researchers what these people looked like: dark hair, dark eyes, dark skin, a physical profile consistent with modern Native American populations. This was not a mysterious lost race. The Windover people were the ancestors. The genetic signature present in those 8,000-year-old brains is the same signature that runs through the indigenous populations of the Americas today. They were the foundation of a line that was never broken. One individual was selected for facial reconstruction, a woman approximately 70 years old at death. One of the oldest recovered from the site, Glenn Doran, who had spent 2 decades studying her remains without ever seeing her face, stood in front of the screen as the reconstruction came together. Dark skin, dark eyes, the classic bone structure of a Native American elder. 8,000 years collapsed into a single image. She looked back into a world that had forgotten she existed. The phrase Stone Age hunter-gatherer carries an automatic image, a marginal existence, bodies worn down by scarcity. The Windover skeletal record dismantled that assumption completely.
Is that makes us who and what we are. That's really what anthropology is about. It's about studying humanity.
Some of the men stood nearly 6 feet tall. Bone density across the population indicated robust physical health. Central Florida, 8,000 years ago, was extraordinarily resourced. Rivers dense with game, coastlines supplying protein year-round. The land was feeding them well. Smithsonian researcher Norin Kouros confirmed this using radioisotopic analysis, measuring stable isotopes of hydrogen preserved in the bones, a chemical fingerprint that reflects the water a person drank during their lifetime. When the hydrogen isotopes of the humans were compared against those of local animals that died in the bog during the same period, they did not match. The animals reflected the local water source. The humans did not. These people had not been living beside the bog. They had been ranging across the entire Florida peninsula, moving with the seasons. Windover was not their home. It was their cemetery. And they were traveling back to it deliberately, sometimes across considerable distances, to bury their dead in this specific place and nowhere else, which meant everything placed alongside those bodies wasn't accidental. It was chosen. What they carried into the grave, jewelry, ornaments, weapons, carefully placed alongside the bodies, positioned with intention. These people held a concept of what came after death. They were equipping their dead for it. The pond may have carried specific meaning, a boundary between the living world and whatever they understood to lie beyond it, a portal significant enough to cross a landscape to reach. Then came the textiles, and they stopped the excavation entirely. Skeletons were found wrapped in woven fabric. Conventional understanding held that textile production this far back in time was not possible. Stone Age people wore animal hides. Weaving was considered a later development, a product of settled agricultural societies, not nomadic hunter-gatherers moving across a subtropical peninsula. America's foremost authority on ancient fabric examined the material in person. It was textile, twined weave, the oldest fabric ever recovered in the Americas. Adult burials showed cloth that had been worn before death, garments used in life and carried into the grave. Infant burials showed fabric with almost no wear at all, made specifically for the burial ceremony. Someone had woven new cloth for a child's death. That is not primitive behavior. That is grief expressed through skilled handcraft. The clearest evidence of social complexity came from a single skeleton, a teenager with spina bifida. The condition had left his legs paralyzed. He could not hunt, could not contribute to the food supply. Every time the community moved camp, which a nomadic group in seasonal migration does constantly, he had to be carried. The physical burden of that across difficult terrain, across seasons, across years, was real and unambiguous. The tribe carried him anyway. He lived into his teens, was cared for throughout. And when he died, he received the same deliberate ceremonial burial as every other member of the community. The bog records something considerably more demanding than survival instinct. It records compassion maintained over years of sacrifice, chosen again and again by people who understood exactly what that choice cost them. That is who they were. But the DNA had one more thing to say. And it was the thing that changed everything about how researchers understood what this place actually was. The dynasty in the DNA. A. Houseworth had not simply analyzed a single individual. He had worked systematically across the genetic material recovered from brains spanning the entire 1,300-year lifespan of the burial site.
Fractured femur, and this was an elderly female that fractured this femur years and years ago.
What he found when he compared the sequences was not the genetic diversity you would expect from an open community drawing members from across a wide region. The sequences were nearly identical, generation after generation, century after century, the same genetic signatures in the same place. These were not strangers who happened to share a burial ground. They were family, an extended interrelated clan returning their dead to the same water across more than a millennium. The tribe showed no outside genetic influence entering the population across that entire span. The Windover people had remained a closed dynasty. The bog was not merely a cemetery. It was the physical center of a lineage, the place where the thread between the living and the dead was maintained and renewed with every burial, held intact across generations that never broke the practice. That kind of continuity does not happen accidentally. It is chosen deliberately, repeatedly, by people who understood exactly what they were preserving. Then Grave 102 complicated the picture. A male, late 20s to early 30s, in the full physical prime of his life. Alongside his remains, a spear point carved from deer antler. The initial assumption was a grave offering, a weapon placed with a hunter for use in whatever came next. Then, the excavation continued. The point was not beside the body, it was inside it, driven deeply into the pelvis, the tip locked into bone with a force that had held it there for 8,000 years. Forensic pathologist Mike Warren, working this site with the same analytical framework he applies at modern homicide scenes, read the trajectory immediately. The wound angled upward from below, which ruled out a ranged spear throw. A spear launched at distance follows an arched trajectory and enters the body angled downward. This wound ran in the opposite direction. The man was already on the ground when the weapon was driven into him. The wound showed no signs of healing. It occurred at or near the time of death. But it was not the fatal injury. No vital structures were struck. Something else had killed him first, most likely a strike between the ribs that passed through soft tissue and left no trace on bone. He went down from the first blow. The second was delivered after. Then the detail Warren couldn't unsee. The skull was missing, not displaced by sediment, not lost to excavation. Every surrounding skeleton in that bog was fully intact. His was not. The top 3 cervical vertebrae, the bones that connect skull directly to spine, were also absent. He had been decapitated. The method, based on fracture evidence at the remaining vertebrae, was not clean. It involved a sharp stone tool, repeated cutting, and force applied to separate the head entirely. Someone with the butchering skills of an experienced hunter applied to a human being. Warren's conclusion was precise. This was not warfare. Florida at this period was sparsely populated. The violence was personal, a grudge, a territorial dispute, an individual act of lethal anger carried through to its absolute conclusion. The head was taken, a trophy, a statement. Inside a community that had carried its paralyzed members across landscapes and woven burial cloth for its infants, one man had been hunted, killed, and deliberately mutilated. Both things were true simultaneously. They always are. What the bog actually proved returned to what Windover actually produced. 168 individuals preserved across 8,000 years in an environment that should have made preservation impossible. 91 intact brains. The oldest human DNA ever recovered at the time of extraction. The oldest textile ever found in the Americas.
technology, especially for accessing the remains. So, we can have students in Europe.
A genetic record spanning 1,300 years of continuous family burial. A forensic homicide case solved without a single piece of modern evidence. Each of those findings would have been significant in isolation. Together, they form a portrait. The Wendover people were not a primitive antecedent to something more developed that came later. They were a fully realized society, operating at a level of sophistication that the existing models of prehistoric America had not predicted and were not prepared to accommodate. They wove complex fabric. They maintained a sacred site across more than a millennium. They cared for their disabled across seasons of difficult migration. They had belief systems elaborate enough to require grave preparation, long-distance journey, and ceremony. They had conflicts personal enough to end in decapitation. These were modern humans living modern human lives, 8,000 years before. Anyone thought to look for evidence of it in a Florida bog. The genetic continuity across 1,300 years of burial confirmed this wasn't a transient population passing through a landscape. This was a people rooted to a place in the deepest possible sense. Not geographically, because the isotope evidence proved they were nomadic, but spiritually and genealogically. The bog was the fixed point around which their entire identity organized itself. They ranged across the peninsula. They always came back. The DNA is the proof of that return, written in sequences so consistent across centuries that the fidelity of the tradition is measurable in the genetic record itself. The Wendover bog was found by accident by a construction worker who climbed off his machine to look at something that seemed slightly wrong. The year was 1984. Glenn Doran, who has spent his career at this site, has said he will probably never encounter anything like it again. He is likely right. But the questions. Wendover opened about who the first Americans were, how long they had been here, and what they had built before history started recording. Those questions now have a method. The bog gave them a starting point. The DNA made it readable. The man in grave 102 did not know his death would be reconstructed by forensic pathologists 8,000 years later. The teenager with paralyzed legs did not know that the people who carried him would one day be cited as evidence of prehistoric compassion. The woman whose face emerged on that screen did not know she would look back into a world that had spent centuries assuming she never existed. They were people, specific, particular, irreplaceable people, living inside a society that wove fabric, honored its dead, and kept returning to the same water across more generations than most nations have existed. The bog preserved them. The DNA read them. What they revealed was not a primitive world awkwardly preceding our own. It was the same world, running on the same minds, held together by the same impulses that still define us. We just needed 8,000 years in the right pond to see it. These people lived 8,000 years before history started writing things down, and the bog kept them anyway. If that changes how you think about who came before us, subscribe. The next buried story is already waiting.